Welcome to the Psychology of Paranormal Phenomena, presented by the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota. This event is part of Dark Reflections, a scholarly series focusing on horror, folklore, death, and the macabre, featuring faculty and associate faculty from the College of Liberal Arts. I'm Megan Mell, Director of Alumni Experiences in the College of Liberal Arts, and I will be your host for today's presentation and the entire Dark Reflections series. Thank you all for joining us this Halloween week as we get into the spooky spirit of the season. Throughout today's conversation, I encourage you to submit a question or reaction or comment for our presenter to address in the second half of the event. And to do this, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter in your question. And certainly, if you have any technical difficulties, feel free to also enter that through the Q&A button, and we will go ahead and address that. This event is being recorded and will be shared out with all registered participants, and will also be available on the Psychology of Paranormal Phenomena event page. Today's presenter is Professor Randy Fletcher. Professor Fletcher is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota. He holds a BA in psychology from the University of California at Berkeley and a PhD in psychology from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He conducts research on the psychological processes involved in reading and language comprehension, and he teaches the psychology department's honors research practicum, a course on the psychology of language, and an honors seminar on the psychology of paranormal phenomena, on which this event is based. Research has shown that most Americans hold one or more supernatural, paranormal, or pseudoscientific belief. Whether it's psychic abilities and fortune tellers or ghosts and hauntings, there's many of them out there. And today, Professor Fletcher will help all of us critically evaluate the evidence for a variety of supernatural and paranormal claims. Professor Fletcher, thank you for joining us. I invite you to begin today's presentation.
As Megan said, my name's Randy Fletcher. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Psychology. I'm a cognitive psychologist. I do research on how people understand and remember things that they read. I have not done any research on paranormal phenomena, but for the last 19 years, it's been my pleasure to teach an undergraduate honors seminar called The Psychology of Paranormal Phenomena, in which I use paranormal and pseudoscientific claims as a vehicle for teaching students about behavioral research methods and critical thinking. It's a course that I absolutely love teaching, and today my goal is to share with you some of the things that we talk about in that course. And here's an overview of what I hope to do. First, I want to start by giving you a little bit of history on scientific investigations of paranormal phenomena. Then I want to talk about what people believe. Do people really believe this stuff? And if so, how widespread are those beliefs? Then I want to briefly address why people believe paranormal and pseudoscientific claims. And I want to finish up by talking a bit about critical thinking and how we can critically evaluate paranormal and pseudoscientific claims. And then, of course, we will have a Q&A session at the end. I'm supposed to leave 30 minutes for that, but I have 59 slides to get through. So I may run over a little bit. If I run over too much, Megan will stop me. But anyway, so let's dive in. So here's an overview of what I want to say about the history of scientific inquiry into paranormal and pseudoscientific phenomena. So in 1948, a couple of young girls in England discovered that they were living with a ghost. Their name were the Fox sisters, Margaret and Kate Fox. They heard rapping noises in the house, and somehow they figured out that these were coming from the spirit of a peddler who they called Mr. Slipfoot, who had been murdered in their home some years before. Now, there is no independent evidence that any such murder ever occurred, but that was what they learned from the spirit, okay? Basically, they were the ones who invented this talking to spirits by knock once for yes, two for no, okay? And using that, they were able to communicate with Mr. Slipfoot. Now, it didn't take long for the Fox sisters to go viral. Okay, so first of all, the press in their little village picked up on it. Then the national press in England picked up on it. And then before you knew it, there were news articles about the Fox sisters being published all around the world. And, well, it didn't take long for other people to decide, hey, I want to get in on this action. I can talk to spirits too. And so by the early 1950s, something called table turning, which we would call seances, became all the rage across the US and Europe. At these events, a group of people called sitters, led by a medium, would sit around a table with their fingertips touching, and then the medium would maybe enter a trance or maybe just start talking and establish contact with a spirit. So after an extended period, a rap would be heard, the table would begin to tilt. There were even cases of like the table floating around the room, the medium floating around the room, dragging the sitters along with it. So back in the day, this was a really, really popular activity. What you going to do on a Friday or Saturday night? There's no internet, no movies, no TV. Hey, let's go to a seance. Okay. So this table turning was the first paranormal phenomena to attract widespread attention from scientists. The most influential early investigator was Michael Faraday, a physicist who kind of figured out the relationship between electricity and magnetism. And he attended some seances, did some experiments, and came to the conclusion that table turning was, in his words, self-deception, resulting from unconscious motor movements guided by expectation. And that was the way most of science viewed this table turning phenomena. But not all, not all. After a bit, there were some well-known scientists who became convinced that there really was something to this table turning phenomenon, that people really were able to communicate with the spirits of those who had passed away. The first such scientist was this guy. His name's Robert Hare. Let me tell you a little bit about him. So he was a professor emeritus of chemistry at the University of Pennsylvania. He invented something called the oxyhydrogen blowpipe, which was a precursor to today's welding torches. And he published a lot of really good papers on chemistry. For some reason, the Philadelphia Inquirer asked him to comment on this whole table turning phenomena. And they published a letter by him in which he basically said there's nothing to it. Here's a quote. I recommend to your attention and that of others interested in this hallucination, Faraday's observations and experiments, recently published in some of our respectable newspapers. I entirely concur with the conclusions of that distinguished expounder of nature's riddles. So he starts off very skeptical about table turning. But after his article came out, some of his friends invited him to attend a circle, that is, a seance. He did, and he was blown away by the experience. So much so that he spent the last 5 years of his life not just investigating, but advocating for spiritualism, and by the end actually became a medium himself. Okay. So in his investigations, he did things like create a device consisting of a circular disc with letters around it that the spirit could use to point to letters in order to spell out responses. So trying to go beyond just simple once for yes, twice for no. So movements at the table would cause a pointer to move about the perimeter of the disc. He tried to be careful to prevent the medium from seeing the disc so that they couldn't cheat. Using this device, Hare was able to talk to a lot of his heroes, including his dead father, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin. If you're from the University of Pennsylvania, Benjamin Franklin has to be one of your heroes. Lord Byron, Isaac Newton, others. So he was able to chat with all of these folks. And as I said, he eventually became the medium himself. Now, if you're interested in Hare's investigations, they're published in a book that's still available today. I have seen it on Amazon. It has the longest names I've ever seen on a book, demonstrating the existence of spirits and their communion with mortals, doctrine of the spirit world, respecting heaven, hell, mortality, and God. Also, the influence of Scripture on the morals of Christians. Whew, that's quite the mouthful. Okay. Well, not surprisingly, spiritualists were absolutely thrilled at Hare's conversion to their point of view. His scientific colleagues, not so much. So the professors at his alma mater, Harvard University, actually got together and passed a resolution denouncing him and his, quote, insane adherence to a gigantic humbug. Moreover, and I think this is just wrong, he tried to present his findings at the 1854 conference of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And he was shouted down. People hooted and booed and hissed and hollered and wouldn't let him give his talk. As I said, I think that's just wrong. They should have just let him have his say and then responded to it in a rational way. Okay. Anyway, many skeptics, most skeptics, attribute Hare's beliefs to his advanced age. So their thinking is that, this guy is old, he's got one foot in the grave. He really, really wants to believe that there is something on the other side, and that's motivating him to see things that really aren't there. The next prominent scientist to get on board with spiritualism was this guy, Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace, along with Charles Darwin, conceived the theory of evolution by natural selection. He didn't do all, Darwin's the one we usually associate with this because he did all of the work of collecting data all over the world to support the theory of evolution by natural selection. Wallace just came for it sitting in his easy chair one night, shot off a paper to a journal, and then the journal sent it out for review. Some of the reviewers knew about Darwin's work, so they let the editor know that, hey, Darwin's been working on this for a while, and that editor arranged for them to publish their paper simultaneously, and that's why they are officially co-creators of the theory of evolution by natural selection. But he began his investigations into spiritualism after attending a seance in 1865. At the time, he was just 42 years old, so in the middle of his career, not an old codger, okay, like Hare. He attended a lot of seances and observed a lot of phenomena that he couldn't explain. The medium disappearing, spirits appearing in midair, the medium levitating, chair and all, flowers, including a whole sunflower, appearing out of nowhere. He didn't really do any scientific investigations. He just went, he saw, he was blown away, and he was convinced, and he tried to convince others. So he tried to get his scientific colleagues to attend, but was mostly unsuccessful. Okay, so what were the criticisms of Wallace? Well, people say he was an astute observer of nature, but wasn't an experimenter. He didn't know how to do the research to try to verify that what he was seeing was real. He also had a predisposition to believe weird stuff. As a 21-year-old, he and one of his friends conducted experiments on something called phrenomesmerism, which combined two of the trendy things of the day: mesmerism, which is the precursor to hypnotism, and phrenology, which is the belief that there are the different, that you can tell something about a person's personality and intellect by the shape of their skull, that different parts of the brain associated with different intellectual gifts, different kinds of things, and that that the parts of the skull underlying those for which you have some exceptional ability are going to be bigger. And if you're not so strong on this, they're going to be smaller. But anyway, Wallace and his friend would do things like mesmerize one another, and then one of them would mesmerize the other, then touch them in the veneration area, and they would drop to their knees and pray, or they would touch them in the aggression area, and they would become belligerent. Now, today we know that the areas identified by phrenology are just nonsense. And so, take it for what it's worth. The fact that Wallace believed in this stuff kind of undermines his credibility in the minds of a lot of scientists. Okay. The next prominent scholar who got into this was William Crookes. Crookes was one of the preeminent chemists and physicists of his day. He discovered the element thallium. He invented the radiometer and the Crookes tube, that really cool thing that your middle school science teacher showed you, where they turned off the lights and you get this stream of blue electrons going down this tube, and you push it and pull it with a magnet. That's the Crookes tube. He was a pioneer investigator of radiation. He contributed to the development of photography. He was knighted for his contributions to science. So William Crookes, very, very serious scholar. Unlike Wallace, he was a superb experimenter. Okay, so Crookes began attending seances in 1869 at the age of 37. So again, not an old codger. He investigated many of the most famous spiritualists of the day and constructed special instruments such as a board with one end on the table and the other on a scale so that you could detect small movements to the table. He tried to employ observers to prevent cheating, though some people have concerns about how he did that. And he also explicitly tested alternative explanations for what he was seeing. So it sounds like pretty good. Like, this guy's making a pretty good argument for there being something to talking to spirits. But that's undermined by a couple of things. In 1887, a magician named S.J. Davy was able to repeat the performance of Crookes' most famous subject, Daniel Douglas Home, by using the tricks of the trade for a stage magician. Diffusion of responsibility among observers, wait till the time is right, and then a little bit of sleight of hand. So the fact that he was able to do everything that Home could do at least raises the possibility that Home was also using the tricks of the trade of a stage magician. Another of Crookes' subjects, who he said, this guy is the real thing, was subsequently caught cheating by another investigator. Well, in the 1880s, the field of scientific inquiry into paranormal phenomena started to broaden out a bit. In 1882, the Society for Psychical Research was founded in London. This was the first scientific organization devoted to the study of paranormal phenomena. And it was created around the investigation of 5 sisters named the Query Sisters, who had become quite well known for mind reading, basically. And so what they would do is one child would lead the room, the others would choose a card or a number, and then the first child would come back and try to guess what card or what number they had chosen. And their performance was considerably better than what one would expect on the basis of chance alone. Unfortunately, they were later caught using gestural and auditory cues, a little cough twice. If it's an even number, cough once. If it's an odd number, things like that. And actually, one of them later in life admitted to cheating, that they basically did this for the attention that it garnered. Well, in the 1930s, J.B. Rhine enters the picture. Okay. J.B. Rhine really wanted psychical research to become a rigorous experimental science. Okay. And he devoted decades of his life to making that happen. He founded something called the Rhine Institute, which continues to exist to this day and to pursue scientific investigations of paranormal phenomena. He coined a lot of the terms that we use today to talk about the paranormal, things like parapsychology, extrasensory perception. Those came from Rhine. He also introduced something called the Zinner deck, which is something that we've probably all seen. It's a deck of cards consisting of 5 stars, 5 wavy lines, 5 pluses, 5 circles, and 5 squares. And he used these to investigate systematically things like clairvoyance and mind reading. Okay, so his basic technique was to shuffle the deck, place it face down, ask somebody to guess the value of the top card, set that card aside, and then just keep going until you get all the way through the deck. Now, there are 5 of each pattern within the deck, so people should be right by chance alone 1/5 of the time. Okay. Rhine published his findings in a 1934 book. His database includes over 91,000 separate trials collected over a 3-year period. His subjects included both professional spiritualists and amateurs. They averaged 7.1 hits, that is correct identifications of the pattern out of a run of 25 guesses, okay? Which, given such a large sample, is a very statistically reliable difference, much better than chance, okay? His best subject, a professional psychic named Herbert Pierce, averaged 8 hits per run. Again, very much better than you would expect by chance alone. Okay? Well, today, most parapsychologists dismiss Rhine's findings because of loose controls. He didn't do a very good job of controlling the situation, poorly made target materials. Apparently, you could actually see through some of the cards in his Zinner deck. And if you can just see through 1 or 2, that's going to get you above chance. He also wasn't very good at documenting what happened. Like, here's what happened on this trial, here's what happened on this trial, etc. His records just don't allow people to go back and look at whether he did things right and whether he's accurately reporting the data, whether he analyzed it correctly, things like that. However, most people in parapsychology acknowledge Rhine's really important influence on the development of their field. Okay. After Rhine, we enter something called the post-Rhine period. So Rhine's card-guessing paradigm dominated experimental parapsychology until the 1960s. Then researchers turned to more complex, more meaningful, and emotion-laden targets. Most now prefer free responding to Rhine's forced choice procedure. The nice thing about the forced choice procedure is you can calculate what chance is. The problem with getting away from that is you can't do that so easily anymore. Some argue that psychic functioning is enhanced by altered state of consciousness, and so that is something you see in post-Rhine research. Computers and random event generators are used to study both ESP and psychokinesis. Remote viewing is another really popular paradigm that we see today, where people sit in a room here and try to tell you what's going on in another part of the city or maybe even another part of the world. Well, now I want to tell you about 2 really, really important investigations, scientific investigations into paranormal claims, because of 2 things. One is these are probably the most high-profile investigations that we've had, and also they really nicely illustrate the main problems that a lot of scientists, a lot of scholars have with research in this area. So in 1974, a couple of physicists from the Stanford Research Institute published an investigation of Uri Geller, who was at that time the best known psychic in the world. In fact, he may be the best known psychic ever. But Targ and Puthoff did some experiments on Geller, and they published their research in Nature, which, if you don't know, is one of the most prestigious scientific publications in the world. And believe me, the editor of Nature took a lot of heat for publishing this, but his claim was that he did it not so much because he believed their results, but because he wanted to encourage further rigorous scientific investigation of paranormal phenomena. So, what kind of things did they test him on? Well, they looked at his ability to identify which of a bunch of containers, small containers, had metal balls inside of them. They also tested his ability to change the reading on a scale. So you put something on a scale, it settles into a value, and then he uses his mind to try to change the measured weight of whatever's on the scale. He also used his mind to try to change the reading on a magnetometer. And what they found was really small, but statistically reliable effects. Okay, so he was able to do this stuff. Not everybody believes it, though. A lot of people were very, very critical of the way Targ and Puthoff conducted their research. Among the most prominent critics were James Randi, a professional magician, and until he passed away a few years ago, probably the world's best known skeptic. But he did a couple of things that convinced him that essentially Geller duped Targ and Puthoff, that he used the tricks of the trade of a professional magician to make it appear that he was doing things with his mind. Okay? One of the things that Randi did was show that he could reproduce using his skills as a stage magician. He could reproduce everything that Geller did. He also worked with Johnny Carson to essentially embarrass the hell out of Uri Geller on an episode of The Tonight Show. So basically, Carson invited Geller to appear on The Tonight Show. He showed up, and they've got this whole display on the table in front of him with props that he could use to repeat some of the kinds of things he did for Targ and Puthoff, plus some of the kinds of things that he did for others. But they did it in a way that made it really, really hard for him to use sleight of hand. They wouldn't let him touch the materials in advance. They didn't let his people close to them. They really kept a close eye on him. And he didn't feel strong that night. And so he wasn't able to do anything. Well, the last study that I want to tell you about along these lines is a series of experiments on feeling the future that were published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, a very, very high quality, high profile psychological journal. They were published by a very esteemed social psychologist named Daryl Bem, who at that time was at Cornell University. And he basically did things like kind of reverse the normal order of events in pretty standard experimental paradigms. So it's not unusual to give people a list of words to try to remember, have them then study some of those, but not others, and then test their recall and show that they remember the ones they studied better than the ones they didn't. Well, what Bem did is show them the words and then ask them to recall them, and then ask them to study some of them, and then go back and see if they remembered the ones that they studied after they wrote down their answers better than the ones they didn't. And he found that they did. He also, it's not unusual, to show people images, okay, and measure their physiological response. People have a greater physiological response to erotic images than to non-erotic images. Okay, good enough. Well, he measured people's physiological responses before they were shown the images and showed the same increase. Okay, when you're about to see an erotic image, you show a greater physiological response than when you're about to see a non-erotic image. Okay, these were very small effects, but they were statistically reliable. Now, did everybody believe it? Absolutely not. Okay, and here are some of the problems that people point to, and these are important. They really, really nail the problem that a lot of psychologists, a lot of scientists have with research in this area. Okay, one is something called the file drawer problem. So the way we test hypotheses in science, okay, is we assume we're wrong. And then we collect some data and show that those data are inconsistent with the assumption that we were wrong. Okay, so for example, if you want to show that somebody has psychokinetic abilities, that they can flip a coin and make it turn up heads more than 50% of the time, okay? You assume that there's no difference, that they're going to flip the coin 50 times and it's only going to come up heads half the time. So you assume that. It's called the null hypothesis. Then you collect some data and you try to show that those data are consistent or inconsistent with that null hypothesis. So if the person flips the coin 50 times and it comes up heads 26 times, are you going to reject the null hypothesis? Probably not. But if it comes up heads 48 times out of 50, you probably will. But where do you draw the line? Well, there is a standard for that, and that standard is you reject the null hypothesis when the results that you get would only be observed by chance 5% of the time or less. Okay, so 1 time in 20. Okay. That leads to the file drawer problem. What if you do the experiment 20 times and it comes up and you get positive results just once? That's what you would expect by chance alone. But if that's the only experiment that gets published and the others go in the file drawer, yikes. Okay, then the scientific record isn't accurately reflecting what's going on in the world. Okay, so people think that they wonder about how many studies are in BIM's file drawer. Okay, also some people have argued that he makes use of something called questionable research practices. For example, let's start the study. Let's collect a little bit of the data and then go back and look at that data. Is it working out? If it is, we keep going. If it's not, we try to figure out what we're doing wrong, change the procedure, and start over again. Okay? And so if you keep doing this, it's going to, the chances of you getting a result by chance alone are significantly inflated beyond that 5%. Okay? And finally, and this is really important, other people have not been able to reproduce BIM's result. Okay? In science, we typically only accept findings that are repeatable, where other people can do the same research and get the same kind of result. Okay? All right. Now, with that as background, I mean, I look at the research that's been done on paranormal phenomena, and I don't find anything that convinces me that there's any there. Okay? But despite that, people believe paranormal and pseudoscientific claims. Okay? One of the best demonstrations of that is a poll that was published by Gallup and Newport in 1991 called Belief in Paranormal Phenomena Among Adult Americans. So they did a national telephone survey of 1,236 adults. They did it all the right way. They used something called a stratified random sample, which means that you make sure that the demographics of your sample reflect those of the population as a whole. And I'm going to show you their questions and how many people said, yes, I believe that. And just for kicks and grins, I'm also going to show you how many of the students in my honor seminar also said, yes, I believe that. So each year when I teach that that honor seminar, before people even come to the first class, I send them Gallup and Newport's survey and ask them to take it. Okay, and then we use that to stimulate some of our discussion. But let's look. Okay, so first question: do you believe that houses can be haunted? Well, 29% of the people in Gallup and Newport's surveys said yes. 44% of our honor students say yes. Do you believe that crystals have special healing power? Only 4% of Gallup and Newport's sample said yes. 10% of our honor students say, yeah, I believe that. Do you believe in channeling or allowing a spirit being to temporarily assume control of the human body during a trance? Okay. 11% of the people in Gallup and Newport's sample said, yep, I believe that. And about 8% of our honor students respond the same way. Do you believe in telekinesis, or the ability of the mind to move or bend objects using just mental energy? 7% of Gallup and Newport samples said, yes, I believe that. None of our honor students, this is just for the last 2 years, by the way. I just looked at data from the last 2 years. Okay. Do you believe in deja vu, or the feeling that you have been someplace or done something before? 55% of Gallup and Newport samples say, yes, I believe that. 95% of our students do. Now, this is a terrible question. It's a terrible question because there is a non-paranormal interpretation of this question, okay? I believe that people have this feeling. And you can say yes if you believe that people have this feeling, even if you don't think there's anything to it. So people may feel like they've been there before, but they really haven't. But you can still say yes. And our students realize that, and I know that from talking to them about this question. Okay? Do you believe that people can hear from or communicate mentally with someone who has died? 18% in Gallup and Newport say yes. 32% of our students say yes. Do you believe in witches? 14% yes in Gallup and Newport, 12% in our students. Now I want to say this is another terrible question. What's a witch? Does it include Wiccans? If it includes Wiccans, that's not necessarily a paranormal belief, okay? And some people think it includes Wiccans and some people don't. Most don't, but some do, and that may inflate the number of people who say yes. Okay? Do you believe in telepathy or communication between minds without using the traditional 5 senses? 30% yes in Gallup and Newport, 17% U of M honor students. Do you believe in ESP or extrasensory perception? Almost half of the people surveyed by Gallup and Newport said yes. Only 17% of our students do. Do you believe in astrology, or that the position of the stars and planets can affect people's lives? A quarter of Gallup and Newport's samples say yes, and about 20% of our students say yes. Do you believe in clairvoyance, or the power of the mind to know the past and predict the future? 26% say yes in Gallup and Newport, but only 5% of our students. Have you ever been in a house that you felt was haunted? 14% yes in Gallup and Newport, 32% of our students. And you're probably starting to see a trend. Our students are way more likely to believe in ghosts than the general population in 1991. Okay? Have you ever felt you were talking to or being talked to by the devil? Now, I want to point out that there are 2 very different kinds of yeses to this question. There's the really scary kind of yes, and then there's also the kind of yes that comes from, if you really, really want a second bowl of ice cream, that's the devil talking to you, okay? So we really don't know how much the yeses that we get from this fall into those 2 categories. But 10% of Gallup and Newport samples say, yes, I believe that, and about 5% of our students. Okay? Have you ever consulted a fortune teller or psychic? 14% yes in Gallup and Newport, 5% of our students. Do you believe in ghosts or that spirits of dead people can come back in certain places and situations? 25% say yes in Gallup and Newport. 44% of our students say yes. Do you believe in reincarnation? That is the rebirth of the soul in a new body after death. 21% yes in Gallup and Newport. 27% of our students. Do you believe that extraterrestrial beings have visited Earth at some point in the past? 27% of Gallup and Newport samples say yes. 20% of our students say yes. Have you ever felt that you were in touch with someone who was already dead? 17% yes in Gallup and Newport. 15% of our students, so pretty similar. Do you believe that people on this earth are sometimes possessed by the devil? 49% yes in Gallup and Newport, only 12% among our students. Do you believe that pyramids have special healing power? 7% yes in Gallup and Newport, none of our students the last couple of years. Last question. Have you ever felt that you were in touch with or getting a message from someone who was far away without using the traditional 5 senses? 25% of Gallup and Newport samples say yes, 13% of our students. Now, Gallup and Newport repeated their survey 15 years later in 2005. Some of the beliefs, particularly in ghosts, haunted houses, and witches, increased over that time. Others, such as the healing power of magnets and crystals and demonic possession, declined. But what is probably more significant is that the number of people ignoring at least one paranormal belief, which was above 50%, remained the same. Moreover, the average number of paranormal beliefs that people endorsed, which was like between 3 and 4, also didn't change. Okay? So it's like the prevalence of paranormal beliefs stayed pretty constant over that time. I can also tell you that over the 19 years that I've been teaching my honor seminar, the prevalence of paranormal and pseudoscientific beliefs hasn't changed. Okay? So the scientific research suggests there's no really good reason to believe paranormal pseudoscientific claims, but clearly people do. So the question becomes why? Why do people believe this stuff? Okay? Well, if you ask skeptics, it's because we're not rational. Okay. The best example of what I'm talking about is Michael Shermer, who was a psychology professor and the editor of Skeptic magazine, wrote a book in 2002 called Why People Believe Weird Things. And in this book, he lays out 25 fallacies in our thinking, things that make us irrational, that make us inclined to believe paranormal and pseudoscientific claims. These include things like confirmation bias, only looking for information that's consistent with what you already believe, ignoring base rates, that is ignoring or being unaware of how often things happen by chance alone, and seeing causal relationships where none exist. Okay, so these are problems with our thinking that Shermer credits for people's belief in paranormal phenomena. Okay, I understand where he's coming from, but this doesn't help us understand why some people are more inclined to believe in paranormal and pseudoscientific claims than others. Okay, now there is some psychological research on this. I want to tell you about it. And there's also, I've learned a bit about this by talking to my students. Okay? Now, one thing that a lot of people expect is that belief in paranormal phenomena is related to intelligence. So a lot of people believe that, but some of them believe that people who are more intelligent should be more likely to believe in paranormal phenomena, and others are just as convinced that people who are highly intelligent should be less inclined to believe in paranormal phenomena. Well, who's right? Well, the answer is neither side. There is absolutely no relationship between IQ and belief in paranormal phenomena. That's something that surprises a lot of people, including myself. Okay. One psychological variable that does seem to be correlated with belief in paranormal and pseudoscientific claims is something called absorption. This is a personality measure which is related to the tendency to become deeply engrossed in sensory or imaginative experiences. And multiple studies have shown that absorption is positively correlated with belief in paranormal and pseudoscientific claims. That correlation across studies ranges from zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.3. So it's not a huge correlation, but it's probably the single largest correlation that we've got. Okay. A couple of variables that I have been kind of interested in when I started looking into this. One is called religiosity, which is a measure that was actually created by my former colleague, Tom Bouchard. It's a measure of how integrated religious beliefs are into the way you live your life. So if you go to church a lot, if you go to Bible study, if you're in the church choir, those things are going to raise your religiosity. Okay. But also, I mean, how much do your religious beliefs influence your political orientation, your willingness to give of your time and your money? So how deeply embedded is religion in the way you live your life? Okay. Religiosity has a really interesting relationship with belief in paranormal and pseudoscientific claims. It's an inverted U. So people who have intermediate levels of religiosity are more likely to believe in paranormal than people who have really low or really high religiosity. Okay? Another variable that I was really interested in and was convinced would be related to belief in paranormal phenomenon is a measure that gets used a lot in educational psychology, and it's called need for cognition. It basically measures, are you willing to just accept things that people tell you, or do you really want to understand them before you go along? Okay. It seems like this ought to be related to your willingness to accept paranormal and pseudoscientific claims. Most of the research, I was able to find a couple of studies that look at this. One of them found no relationship, but the other one found a really weird kind of relationship. So people who have certain personality characteristics and have no strong preference for either their left or their right hand are more likely to accept paranormal claims if they're high in need for cognition. Now, this is just a little too weird, and it wasn't what the researchers were expecting, and it hasn't been replicated. So I don't think you can really believe it, but there's at least a little bit of a tease there. Well, in talking to my students about why people believe paranormal and pseudoscientific claims, the two things that they always point to and that make a huge amount of sense to me are personal experience and friends. So if you find yourself in a house that surely seems haunted, that's going to impact your belief in ghosts. Okay. Moreover, if you grow up with a group of people who are really into tarot cards, and this is like a big part of their social interaction with each other, you don't want to be left out, so you get on board with that. So personal experience and friends seem to be major drivers of people's willingness to believe in paranormal and pseudoscientific claims. I'm running short on time, so I'm starting to rush a little. I hope I don't overdo it, okay? The last thing I want to talk about, okay, is something that I really spend a lot of time on in the honor seminar, and that is critical thinking, okay? How can we critically evaluate pseudoscientific and paranormal claims? Well, what I teach students to do is to use these 5 questions. Anytime they're presented with a paranormal or pseudoscientific claim, go through these 5 questions before you try to decide if this is something you want to believe. Question 1, what exactly is the claim that I'm being asked to believe? Question 2, what evidence supports the claim? Question 3, are there any alternative interpretations of that evidence? So in other words, if the original claim is wrong, why am I seeing this evidence? Okay. Fourth, what additional evidence do I need in order to evaluate the alternatives? And then it's only after you've asked all of those and hopefully answered them that you should ask yourself, what's the most reasonable conclusion? Now, in order to introduce students to this, as I said, this is something that I keep coming back to over and over and make students do this a lot, okay? But here's the experiment that I use to introduce the use of these 5 questions to students, okay? And it's an experiment that was done on psychokinesis, okay? Now, here's a definition of psychokinesis from somebody who really believes in psycholinguistics and psychokinesis, okay? I study psycholinguistics. They study psychokinesis. Psychokinesis, or if you're cool, PK, is the ability of some people to bypass their motor mechanism and by volition, that is, by just thinking about it, reach directly into space and time outside themselves to exert a force. So if you watch the movie Carrie, she goes to prom. The mean students spill blood all over her while she's up on the stage. And all of a sudden, doors start to slam shut, windows start to slam shut, things start flying around, terrible things start happening, and they're all caused by Carrie's mind, okay? That's psychokinesis. Right? So there used to be, back when I was first designing my honor seminar, there was a part of the internet called Usenet, which was a ginormous family of hierarchically organized family of online discussion groups. So this was where you would go for online conversations about any hobby, any musician or artist that you were interested in, any academic discipline that you were interested in. And there were a couple of these Usenet news groups devoted to discussions of paranormal phenomena. One called Alt.Paranormal was populated primarily by true believers. The other, called Psi.Skeptic, was dominated primarily by the skeptics, but there was crosstalk between these. And someone posted something in both of these groups that I found really interesting. It was basically this person was saying, ha, 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 all you skeptics, you keep telling me that I need to empirically test my belief in psychokinesis. Well, I did it, and here is proof positive that psychokinesis is real, okay? So let's look at this experiment. It took place, so I don't know, the guy who posted this was posted from a Stanford University email address. I have no idea what his affiliation with Stanford was, but he had a Stanford email address. Somewhere in the Bay Area where Stanford is located, at that time, there was a 30-minute long weekly television show where every Sunday you could tune in for half an hour while a minister gave a live sermon. So a California televangelist gave a sermon, and in one of these, he really focused on Satanists and watching out for Satanists, making sure there aren't Satanists out there trying to influence your children. Okay, so this was in one of these broadcasts. One of the things that he warned his audience to look for was a hand sign called the cornuto. This is supposed to be the devil's head and horns. So don't let your kids listen to any of them rock and roll records where they're doing this on the cover. Okay, now make sure we know what we're talking about. Cornuto. Okay, so this young man is named Galder, and he is part of a musical group called Dimmu Borgir, and they play a genre of music called Norwegian death metal. And people who are followers of Norwegian death metal have been tied in Norway to something like 50 church burnings and at least one murder. Moreover, One of the artists who was very big in Norwegian death metal was ostracized when people found out that he was really a Wiccan and not a real Satanist. But if you look at our friend Galder here, you can see his tats. He's got a 666. He's got a pentagram. And if you listen to the music, you don't have to play it backwards to hear the satanic messages. They're right there front and center. So yeah, I don't necessarily want my small child listening to their music. But it turns out there is a website that does nothing but publish photographs of people making the cornuto. Here are some examples. Oh my God, Matthew McConaughey making the cornuto. The former Pope making the cornuto. Sarah Palin making the cornuto. Okay, so we all know what we're talking about here. Okay, so in one of his Sunday shows, the minister warns people about Satanists and about the cornuto in particular. During a subsequent telecast, our intrepid experimenter, together with 4 trained witches, and don't even get me started on that, what in the world is a trained witch, tried to use psychokinesis to force the televangelist to make the sign himself. Now, I think this is really, really clever, okay? They claim that during the live broadcast, he made the sign 23 times, okay? Now, he offered, this was before YouTube, okay? So he offered, send me $15 and I'll send you a recording. I really wish I'd sent away for that recording, but I didn't. But let's give him this. Let's say if we looked at the recording, we would see at least somewhere close to 23 of these hand signs, okay? His claim is that this is proof positive that psychokinesis is real. Let's use these 5 questions to critically evaluate that claim. So what exactly, and in class, I asked students to write down their answers to these without putting their name on it and turn them in to me afterwards. After they've written down their answers, I have them talk about them in small groups, and then we talk about them as a group of the whole. So I try to make this interactive. Unfortunately, we can't do that. So I'm just gonna kind of walk through these, okay? What exactly is the claim that I'm being asked to believe? I would say the claim is that the minister made the sign 23 times because of the psychokinetic intervention of the experimenter and the 4 trained witches. What evidence supports the claim? Well, the 23 signs on the recording that we don't have, okay? Now we really get into the heart of it. Are there any alternative interpretations of this evidence? And I suspect that all of you are coming up with some alternatives. Students, when they write things down, sometimes write down some pretty strange stuff. Some people think that maybe the minister is secretly a Satanist, or that he is in league with the experimenter. I've even had a student suggest that aliens were controlling the whole situation. But once they talk about it, they pretty quickly zero in on what I think is the most reasonable alternative explanation, which is that people just do that with their hands sometimes. If we look back at our examples of cornuto, okay, Matthew McConaughey is at a University of Texas football game, okay? The Texas University Longhorns. If you're not familiar, the Longhorn steer is Texas's kind of lame version of Goldie Gopher, okay? So every time they score a touchdown, people jump up and go, hook 'em horns, okay? That's what McConaughey's doing. So he's making this of his own volition, and it has nothing to do with cornuto. The former Pope, apparently this is a hand gesture that he used a lot. I'm not willing to believe that that was because he was a Satanist. I think that's just something that he did, okay? Sarah Palin, she's actually making the American Sign Language sign for I love you, okay? But it looks an awful lot like the cornuto, and all of these pictures made the website with photos of people throwing the cornuto out there, okay? So our alternative explanation is that people just did this on their own, and it had nothing to do with the trained witches, okay? what additional evidence do I need in order to evaluate the alternatives? Well, students are really, really good at zeroing in on the problem here, which is that we have no baseline. There's no control condition. We don't know how often the minister would make the sign in the absence of the intervention by the experimenter and the four trained witches. Okay, so if I were doing this experiment, what I would do is take the half hour and divide it into 6 5-minute segments. Randomly choose 3 of those where the witches would do their thing and have them leave the minister alone during the other 5-minute segments. Then I would have a couple of raiders who didn't know when the witches were exerting their influence go through and try to identify all the signs. Only look at those that they agreed on where they both thought, yep, there's a sign here. And then after they had identified the signs, I would figure out how many of them occurred when the witches were exerting their influence and how many when they weren't. Now, if all 23 happen while the minister or while the experimenter and the trained witches are exerting their influence, and none while they're not, that's evidence for psychokinesis. But if there's 13 when they're exerting their influence and 12 when they're not, I'm not buying it. Okay, again, that could be chance alone. So for me, this does not constitute strong evidence for the reality of psychokinesis. A lot of people in this online forum pointed this out to the original experimenter, encouraged him to go back and redo the experiment with the appropriate control condition. And I watched that forum for months afterwards, and he never came back. So either he thought he had already proved his point, or he did it and it didn't work out the way he wanted. We'll never know. Okay. So I finally made it through my 59 slides and only went over by 4 minutes. And so I guess we'll have questions, but before we do, there are a lot of things that I talk about in that course on the psychology of paranormal phenomena that I haven't had a chance to address here. I've listed as many of those as I could fit on the slide here. So if you have questions about any of the things I've talked to or about any of the things on this slide, I'll do my best to answer them. That's all I've got.
We have a lot of questions coming in. So we're going to go ahead and move to the Q&A portion of the event. Just a reminder, our audience can submit questions or comments through the Q&A button. And we'll go ahead. We'll try to get through as many questions as we have time for. So a few came through kind of tied more to the beginning of your presentation. So I'm going to ask you about 2 or 3 people. So one of our attendees asked, Arthur Conan Doyle was said to be a true believer in seance or paranormal activity. Also Harry Houdini, who was another magician who went about debunking, exposing these mediums as frauds. Are there any references to these 2 people in your readings?
Absolutely. Yes, Arthur Conan Doyle. I mean, it's kind of ironic given that his most famous character was Sherlock Holmes, who was like the most rational person a person could possibly be. But Arthur Conan Doyle was like all in for spiritualism. He was a very uncritical true believer in spiritualism. Harry Houdini is really, really interesting. He was, by all accounts, a really big mama's boy. And when his mother passed away, it was really hard on him. And he had a really, really hard time accepting her death. And so he sought out a spiritualist, somebody who could put him in contact with his mother. And initially, this was something that he found very comforting. It's something he found very helpful. But eventually, he came to the conclusion that he was being scammed, that this person was basically cheating him. Okay. And so he went totally the other direction and became a real opponent of spiritualism. He did a lot of investigations of spiritualism. He did a lot trying to expose cheaters in this realm. He kind of started a tradition that was carried on by James Randi, Penn and Teller, and other stage magicians who tried to expose cheating among people who claim to have paranormal and pseudoscientific abilities.
And then we have one more, maybe about a more current or more recent person. Our guest asks, what about the work of Dr. Robert Morris, the chair of the Kessler Institute at the University of Edinburgh? Are you familiar with that person?
I'm writing the name down. I'm pretty sure one of the things I do in the class is have students divide up into groups and prepare group projects where each group gets 2 days, 2 class days to present on fortune telling, telepathy, what's next, astrology, feng shui, and neurolinguistic programming. And I'm pretty sure this name has come up in at least one of those group presentations, but I don't remember it. So this is not someone I am familiar with. If the person asking that question could email me, I would love to look at it. My email address is fletc002@umn.edu, and I'd love to hear from you.
Great, thank you. I'll go ahead and put that in the chat as well. We have another question that came in. So moving on a little bit into your presentation, this person says, in my experience with paranormal discussions, there is an overlap between spiritual beliefs and the belief in paranormal occurrences. When it comes to critical thinking and deconstructing paranormal occurrences, is it always beneficial to do so? How does assessing these issues overlap with the mental benefit of having belief systems culturally?
I think that's a fabulous question. I try to make it clear to the students in my class is that it is not my goal to turn them all into skeptics. That I want them to understand, though, that if they believe paranormal claims, they're doing it on faith alone. And that's not necessarily bad. That is a very, very personal decision that each individual has a right to make. So yeah, I appreciate the question, and I said to me these things are a vehicle for teaching students about critical thinking and behavioral research methods. So I'm okay with students believing paranormal claims as long as they realize that they're doing it on faith alone, and as long as they have an understanding of what it would take to provide scientific evidence that there's something to this belief.
And speaking of evidence, one of our guests asks, I'm curious about the challenge of defining what counts as evidence these days, or how evidence, in quotes, is defined while answering those critical thinking questions.
I think it really depends on the specific claim. I mean, there are lots of things that people put out there as evidence to support claims. The most common kind of evidence is anecdotes. I mean, things about personal experience. And that's when it comes to that as evidence, it's can be a little dicey. Um, it's hard to know what to make of someone's personal experience. To me, it's like the kind of repeatable scientific evidence that you can get from an experiment are what I would find compelling. But like I said, it depends on the nature of the claim. I mean, for example, if you believe in Bigfoot, the most compelling evidence would be to find Bigfoot. Um, and actually, an interesting story about that. God, I don't remember how long ago, maybe 10 years ago, right before the beginning of the semester where I was going to teach this course, someone claimed to have found the remains of a dead Bigfoot. They found these remains that kind of seemed somewhere between human and ape, and and the story was picked up by the press, and it again went viral all over the world. And part of the story was that they had sent these remains to some prominent geneticists who had looked at the DNA and found that it was nothing that we know about, that it was kind of similar to humans, similar to ape, but different from both. The story went all over the place, but then someone finally called up this famous geneticist and say, "Hey, what's up?" And he had no idea what they were talking about. And that was kind of the end of the story. But it's a little disappointing that it took that long for somebody to go back and check with this person. So that's the kind of case where just finding the remains, that would have been really compelling evidence, okay, and would have proven that
And
Bigfoot is real.
we have kind of along those same lines, someone else had asked, what do you have to say about people's beliefs in vampires and werewolves, other paranormal phenomena?
Honestly, I don't know that much. I haven't really looked into to vampires and werewolves. Um, I should probably find out. It's not something I know anything about.
Okay, great. Thank you.
It,
So on
it
this,
is not my impression. Maybe I'm wrong, and if so, please educate me. It's not my impression that those are widely held beliefs.
great. Yes. I mean, it's not my impression either, but certainly throughout history, we've seen those beliefs. And we have lots of stories and fantastic literature that has come out of those beliefs as well, those stories. On on the slide that you have up right now, there's a
Mhm.
number of different things on here, and we have two people in our audience who are asking specifically about a couple of them. One has asked, how does Myers-Briggs personality type indicator fit into the psychology of paranormal phenomena? Why is it on this slide? Why is it part of
It's on because in addition to the paranormal, I talk about pseudoscience. Okay, and I actually devote 3 classes to pseudoscience. The first one is on just a general introduction to pseudoscience. What's the difference between science and pseudoscience? What are some examples of pseudoscience? What kind of helps you spot that something is pseudoscience? The second class is devoted to the unfortunate prominence of pseudoscience within psychology. Okay. And then the final one is on what I consider a really, really interesting borderline case, and that is polygraphy, lie detection. So there's both a science and a pseudoscience to that, and trying to tease them apart is a really, really interesting exercise. In the case of Myers-Briggs, it reflects something that clinical psychologists who we have a former student from our department, a clinical psychologist named Scott Lilienfeld, who has done a lot of research and written a lot about pseudoscience within psychology. And he has edited a really fabulous book, the name of which I don't remember off the top of my head, but it brings together a lot of the information on this. But in it, they talk a lot about the science practitioner gap. So the gap between what science tells us therapists ought to be doing and what they actually do. Okay. Now, within the realm of diagnosis, what they tell us is that the research says that we should only be using um, diagnostic instruments that have been shown in research to be valid and reliable. Okay. Now, the distinction there is important. Reliable means it gives you the same answer every time. Valid means it means what you think it means. So the example I use with students is if every time I step on my bathroom scale, it says I weigh 40 pounds, it's reliable. It's giving me the same answer every time, but it's not valid. It has nothing to do with what I actually weigh. Okay. Now, in the case of the Myers-Briggs, okay, um, the claim that these folks make is that it is very reliable, but it's not valid. Okay. That the Myers-Briggs is used primarily for vocational guidance, but research has shown that Myers-Briggs results have very, very poor correlations with occupational satisfaction or occupational success. So maybe, and it's like every student I've ever had has had to take the Myers-Briggs when they were in high school, and they've been given occupational advice on the basis of that. And if what my clinical colleagues have to say about the Myers-Briggs is true, that's probably not a good idea.
And we also had a question about the polygraph and false
Yeah,
positives.
I'm sorry, the polygraph and what?
False positives
Oh,
tied to the
okay.
polygraph.
Yeah. So um, polygraph. I have a couple of former colleagues, one who's passed away, another one who was his student who has now graduate or who is now retired, who have done fabulous research on polygraphy. Okay, so basically, what the polygraph measures is an emotional reaction. Okay, so you measure respiration rate, you measure galvanic skin response, which basically is a measure of how well the skin on your hands conduct electricity, which is impacted by how sweaty you are. Okay, so how fast you're breathing, how sweaty is your skin? There's something else it measures that I'm blanking on right now. Respiration, galvanic skin response, heart rate, I think. But anyway, and it's well known that when people have an emotional response, these things go up. Okay, these measures increase, and that can be a sign of deception. But unfortunately, it can be a sign of other things too. So at some point, I think it was in the 70s sometimes, the federal government made it illegal for any employer other than itself to use polygraph tests to screen employees or prospective employees. But back before that, I actually had a roommate who's, as a high school student, had applied for a job at Burger King, and they made him take a polygraph. And they didn't hire him because the polygraph suggested to them that he used marijuana. Now, at that, I mean, when I knew him, he used marijuana and he was very upfront about it. But as a high school student, he was like militantly against the use of drugs, including marijuana. And he had just had a huge argument with his girlfriend because he found out she used marijuana. This caused a big blow up. They actually broke up over it. And so he went in, they hooked him to the polygraph, and they asked him, "Do you ever use marijuana?" And the little needles just started bouncing all over the place. It's an emotional reaction. Okay. And it misled them. Okay. But anyway, my former colleague, David Licken, came up with a version of the polygraph test, which seems to really work. It's something called the guilty knowledge test, where instead of asking, the way the standard polygraph works is you ask people control questions, which are typically questions that are unrelated to what you're investigating, but that you assume people will lie about. Like, have you ever taken something from somebody who trusted you? Okay, and you assume people are going to lie about that. And if they say, "Yes, I have," you make them write down all the instances and ask them, "Other than that, have you ever taken something from somebody who trusted you?" And if they say yes again, you make them write. And so you get them to the point where they've written down everything and they say, "No, I've never done this." You still assume they're lying. And so the polygraph readings at that point reflect known lies. So then you ask them the relevant questions. O.J. Simpson, did you murder Ron and Nicole? And if the reaction of the little needles is even greater than it was on the control questions, you assume that he's lying. Okay, but again, it could be an emotional response. There are known techniques for defeating that. If you put a tack in your shoe, and every time you get a control question, you roll your foot over the tack, the little needles will bounce all over the place, which kind of raises the bar and makes it harder to detect actual lies. Okay. But anyway, this control question test goes in a different way. Instead of the guilty knowledge test goes in a different direction. Instead of looking at control questions and relevant questions, what you do is you say, "Okay, somebody robbed the bank." Okay. if you are the person who robbed the bank, you're going to recognize which of these pictures is the teller who was robbed. And then you show them 5 photographs and measure their physiological responses to each of them. You then say, okay, the robber wrote a note on the back of a candy bar wrapper. Was that candy bar wrapper a Snicker? Was it a $100,000 bar? You give them 5 choices, okay? The way the guilty knowledge test works is that if the person shows the greatest physiological response to the right answer every time, then they know something that only the person who robbed the bank and the people who are deeply involved in the investigation are going to know. That is the right way to do a polygraph test, but it's not the way it's practiced. The way it's practiced, I mean, if you're a psychopath, you don't respond emotionally to lying. You can use these countermeasures like the tack in your foot to get around it. There's a really interesting limited series that I don't know if it's available anywhere anymore, but it used to be on Netflix. It's called The Assets, and it was about a guy who worked for the FBI counterintelligence unit and who was selling information to the Soviet Union, including the identities of all of the US's assets inside the Soviet Union, who were all but summarily rounded up and executed. And he regularly had to pass polygraph tests, but he was able to do that using the countermeasures. Okay. My colleague, Bill Iacono, who's now retired, has done a lot of really interesting research on the control question version of the polygraph test. And what he argues is that it's pretty good at detecting people who are really guilty if they're not psychopaths, and you can prevent them from using countermeasures. But it's terrible at detecting that somebody is innocent. Okay, because people have strong emotional responses to being asked if you know you're suspected of killing somebody and they ask you, did you kill? You're going to have an emotional reaction to that, and that can be interpreted as a sign of guilt. So anyway, he always says never take a polygraph test if you're innocent.
Excellent advice.
But
Would say.
interestingly, as I said before, the federal government allows itself to use polygraph tests to screen employees. And you probably know what the Los Alamos National Lab is. That's where all of our country's nuclear weapons are developed. Everybody who's anybody in high energy physics is given a talk there. Going back to Einstein and Niels Bohr, everybody gives a talk there. The best attended talk that they've ever had was by my colleague Bill Iacono talking about polygraph tests. They filled up one room. They had another room that was where they piped in video, and then another room where they just piped in audio, and they all filled up. Because the people who work there have to pass polygraph tests on a regular basis, and they are scared to death of it because they know they can lose their jobs if they don't pass.
Wow. Well, let's all hope that we don't have to take one of those anytime soon, but we'll bring a tack along just in case. All right. Well, we have so many more questions, but we are reaching the end of our time. So moving it back into the realm of the supernatural, we had a question come in. What are some common cognitive biases that make people more susceptible to believing in the supernatural?
Well, I would encourage whoever asked that question to look at the book by Michael Shermer. He goes through a long list of them, and I actually did include some of them in my slide. If I can find that.
And can you share the title of the book?
Oh, it's called Why People Believe Weird Things. I think that's right.
Great. I'm happy to include that in our follow-up email to anyone who views this webinar or has attended the event as
Okay,
well.
here are the three examples that I included on my slide: confirmation bias, which is basically the phenomenon that we only look for and only notice and only pay attention to information that's consistent with our prior beliefs. Ignoring base rates, that is not paying attention or not understanding how frequently things happen by chance alone, and seeing causal connections where none exist. But there are other things like reasoning by representativeness. God, there's so many of them. But yeah, I highly recommend the book by Shermer if that's something that you're interested in. The final chapter, I think it is, where he goes through his 25 fallacies, and a great many of, they're not all cognitive, but a lot of them are. Some of them are kind of deficits in our probabilistic and logical reasoning.
Great, thank you. And you answered another question someone asked about book suggestions. So
Oh.
that's one. I don't know if you have more that you'd like to suggest.
There are lots of books on this topic. There are also some really good videos. One video that I really would encourage anyone interested in this stuff to look at is a video. It's an episode of the PBS science series Nova, and it's called what's it called? Secrets of the Psychics. Okay. And it features James Randi. The first half of it kind of shows you some of his greatest hits, including video of Uri Geller's appearance on The Tonight Show. The second half of it follows Randi to the Soviet Union shortly after it was opened up to Westerners, so he could investigate some of the incredible claims coming out of there about psychic abilities. But I actually make my students watch it to look for examples of those 5 questions in action, because James Randi wields them like a knife.
That's fantastic. Thank you. We'll be sure to include the books you recommended, the Nova special, and also other resources in our follow-up email. So thank you again. We've come to the end of our event. We've made it through many of our audience questions, not all of them, but thank you to everyone who submitted a question or comment. A special thank you to our presenter, Professor Randy Fletcher, for helping us explore the science behind some of our most haunting supernatural beliefs. It was very exciting. Our next event in the Dark Reflections series will be Women and Witchcraft, the figure of the witch in history, literature, and pop culture. That's happening tomorrow, October 28th at 12 p.m. Central Time. You can find more information about this and other presentations by visiting our website at z.umn.edu/darkreflections. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and I'm wishing you a thrilling Halloween.